You have never once, in your entire life, had to build a house out of nothing. Not really. Not from nothing. Somebody built the walls around you long before you moved in, and somewhere between the thermostat and the front door, you've probably never had to ask what happens if all of it just isn't there. No landlord. No contractor, no hardware store 2 miles down the road, no blanket waiting in a closet you didn't build. Just you, the open air, and whatever the night decides to do. Most people assume the answer is simple. Before houses, humans just suffered. They shivered through the night, hoped the rain stopped, and counted themselves lucky if they woke up at all a grim, gray stretch of history before someone finally invented the wall. Is that really what happened? Because for 290,000 years, before the first wall was ever stacked, before anyone had a roof, a door, or a lock, your ancestors weren't hiding from the world with nothing. They were solving it. Piece by piece, threat by threat, they built something so complete it worked exactly like a house, without a single brick. And somewhere in the walls around you right now, some of that system is still standing. Here's how big that stretch of time actually is. 290,000 years is thousands of generations, stacked one after another, of people who never once flipped a switch, and every single one of them made it through enough nights to have you here listening to this. That's not luck repeating itself thousands of times in a row. Luck runs out eventually. Something else was holding the line, generation after generation, in places with no walls at all. That's a system. 4 things were trying to kill you, if you were alive back then. Cold, predators, rain, and the dark. Every single one of them had to be solved, in order, or none of the others mattered. Cold came first, because cold doesn't wait. Humans are, biologically speaking, a tropical animal. No thick fur, no blubber, no layer of insulation built into the skin. Strip away every tool a person has ever invented, and a human dropped into a freezing night is about as prepared for it as a house cat left outside. For most of your ancestors' history, especially during the deep cold of the Ice Age, that should have been a death sentence the first time the temperature dropped below freezing. And it wasn't a single bad night either. It was every night, for months at a stretch, in places where the ground itself froze solid. Fire solved it. But fire has a catch nobody mentions. Fire doesn't travel with you. The moment you step away from it, you're cold again, and a fire can't follow you into your own footsteps the next morning. So the real solution wasn't fire alone. It was what fire made possible. Not a hide thrown over the shoulders and hoped for the best, but clothing that actually fit the body, sealed at the seams, holding heat in the way a loose drape never could. That took a tool nobody expects, a needle. Researchers led by Mark Stoneking studied lice, of all things, to figure out when clothing began, because body lice can only survive inside fabric, not on bare skin. Their genetic split from head lice points to humans wearing real, fitted clothing around 107,000 years ago. Long before anyone wrote anything down, long before anyone farmed a single crop, your ancestors had already solved cold with a piece of technology small enough to lose in the grass. Solve cold, and you create the next problem immediately. A body warm enough to survive the night still needs somewhere to lie down. And lying down, unprotected, in the dark, is exactly the moment a predator wants you. You had no claws, no fangs, no thick hide to shrug off a bite. And this wasn't some ordinary patch of wilderness. Cave lions, bigger than any lion alive today. Cave hyenas that could crack bone with a single bite. Cave bears twice the size of a modern grizzly that could look a grown adult in the eye without rising onto their back legs. The world around you was full of animals built for exactly one job, and you weren't it. If you were slow, you got caught. If you slept somewhere exposed, you might not wake up at all. So the answer wasn't strength, because strength was never going to be enough. It was positioning. A spot with your back against stone. A group awake in shifts, so no single person had to face the dark alone. A fire kept low enough to see by, but bright enough to matter. Archaeologist Lynn Wadley and her team found something remarkable at Sibudu Cave in South Africa. Layers of bedding, made from carefully selected plants, some of them naturally insecticidal, laid down deliberately and replaced again and again, now dated to 77,000 years old. That's not an animal curling up wherever it happens to land. That's a decision. That's someone choosing, on purpose, exactly where danger couldn't reach. Solve the predator problem, and the rain finds you anyway. Because water has never once cared how safe your spot is. It gets into everything. The fire, the bedding, the stored food. A single bad storm could undo every solution to every other threat in one night, soaking the bedding, drowning the fire, and leaving you exposed to both the cold and whatever was hunting through the wet dark. So shelter had to do double duty, keeping the cold out and the water out at the same time, using nothing but the landscape itself and a few carried tools. A cave mouth angled the right way, so wind and rain swept past the entrance instead of straight through it. A windbreak of branches and hide, propped at an angle, learned through trial and error, and probably more than a few, miserable, soaked nights before anyone got the angle right. Some earlier version of the same mistake you'd make the first time you ever tried to pitch a tent in the wind. Even in the coldest, most open parts of the Ice Age, actual freestanding structures, built from mammoth bone, at a site called Prehistoric, in what's now Ukraine, somewhere between 15 and 18,000 years old. No trees for miles in that landscape, so they built with what the land actually offered them instead. Bone as a frame, hide stretched over it as a wall. A roof made from the same animal that would have, in any other era, been nothing but dinner. And then there's the dark, the one threat, with no single weapon and no shelter that fully solves it on its own. Nightfall didn't just bring danger. It brought hours with absolutely nothing to do, and every reason to be afraid of the silence. So the answer here wasn't physical at all. It was social. Groups stayed close together, took turns staying alert while the others slept, and used the long, forced stillness for something you'd almost call a technology in its own right: teaching. Passing down, out loud, exactly which plants worked as bedding, which rock faces blocked the worst of the wind, which valleys pooled cold air overnight and should be avoided entirely. A child born into one of these groups didn't have to discover any of this alone. They inherited it the same way you inherited a working light switch without ever asking who figured out electricity, or a working furnace without ever asking who figured out how to trap heat in the first place. This knowledge took generations to build, and it had to be handed down every single time, deliberately, out loud, around a fire, or a group arriving in an unfamiliar landscape would have to learn all of it again the hard way, making the same cold, wet, badly angled mistakes the last group made 100 years earlier in some completely different valley. Losing that chain, even once, could cost a generation everything the last one had painstakingly worked out. Here's the part most people miss completely. Every one of those four solutions wasn't actually separate. Put them together, all at once, and you don't get four scattered survival tricks sitting side by side. You get a house, an actual, functioning house, just not the kind you're picturing. The fire was the heating system. The windbreak or the cave mouth angled just right was the wall. The fitted clothing was the insulation, worn instead of built into the structure. The layered insecticidal bedding was the floor. The group, awake and alert in rotating shifts through the night, was the security system, doing exactly what a locked door does for you now. And the choice of where to stop, which slope, which cave mouth, which direction the wind was coming from that particular season, that was the architecture, decided fresh every single time by people who understood their environment with a level of precision most of us will never come close to matching. They could look at a hillside and know, before a single drop fell, exactly where the water would pool by morning. They could feel a wind shift and already know which cave mouth would fill with smoke instead of clearing it. None of that came from an instruction manual. It came from paying closer attention to the world than almost anyone alive today has ever had to. Somewhere in that whole list is your thermostat too. It just used to be a decision, not a dial. This is what was promised at the start. It's still standing, not as bone and hide anymore, as drywall, blown-in insulation, a furnace humming in a closet, a door with a lock on it. But the shape of it never actually changed. Somebody, a very long time ago, figured out that safety was never really a wall. It was a system. And every part of that system eventually got frozen into the walls you're sitting inside right now. So completely that most people never even think to ask where any of it came from. There's one more thing worth knowing here, because it's easy to picture all of this as grim, and it wasn't. Fire control alone goes back roughly 1 million years, to hearths like the ones found at Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, studied by researcher Francesco Berna and his team. 1 million years is not a species barely holding on, night after miserable night. 1 million years is a species that had already figured out how to be safe enough to sit still, to gather around light and warmth, to talk and teach, and pass down what the day had taught them, long before anyone called any of it a home. The next time your own power goes out for an evening, and the house goes quiet and a little too cold, and everyone ends up sitting closer together than usual around whatever light is left, notice how instantly familiar that feels. Nobody has to explain the rules. Nobody has to be taught how to do it. Your body already knows, because it's been doing some version of this for 290,000 years. That's not a coincidence. That's the oldest part of the system, still running, right under the newer one, waiting for the exact moment the newer one fails. Your ancestors weren't enduring a worse version of your life. They were running the exact same system you're running today, just built from nothing but knowledge, fire, and each other, before anyone had ever laid a single brick. You have never once in your entire life had to build a house out of nothing, but somebody did, and every wall around you right now is proof they figured it out.